So tariffs are a key driver of what's happening in markets at the moment. A difficult point of them is that they keep changing. And so we're just going to try and pull out some nuggets and truths that we think are important because they're influencing both economies and markets into the future. Liberation Day was the day that Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs across all imports into America. And this slide that we're showing you now just shows firstly, the purple line being the tariffs that are charged on US exports to these different countries mentioned here. And the gray line is the new tariff that Donald Trump announced for those countries' exports to the USA. And really, this was in addition to the baseline 10% tariff on any import into the US, as well as a 25% tariff on automobiles, steel and aluminium. The concern that we're going to unpack now is what impact will this have on both the global economy and global trade. So what will these trade tariffs do to inflation? That's the big concern. And this graph just shows you the inflation, two different measures of it in the US, and how it's come down of late, but still higher than it used to be prior to the COVID. And we can see that at the moment it's between sort of 2 and 3%. The Fed would ideally like it below 2%, but the risk with these tariffs is that it actually moves up rather than down. And in 2025, a lot of economists are expecting that it could go to between 3 and 4%, possibly even higher depending where things land. And that is a concern that makes the consumer less optimistic, and on the back of that, the economy could slow down in the US and the risk of recession increases. So a 25% tariff on automobiles and parts feeds through into the economy in a number of ways. Obviously on purchases of new vehicles that are imported, but it also affects not only the spare parts. We've seen an increase already starting to come through in second-hand vehicles, and as well as on insurance for vehicles, because they have to insure against these higher costs coming in if a car is in an accident. And these concerns are creating uncertainty around what that knock-on effect will be to the economy, that the economy potentially slows down because of these increased costs coming through and because inflation is higher. Having a look at this slide, it just unpacks the different levels of revenue that will be generated depending where tariffs land. Now, bear in mind that the Trump administration is trying to generate additional revenue to get the country's balance sheet back in order. And if they're aiming for around $1 trillion of additional revenue, they're also looking at trying to cut costs. That's what DOGE is all about. Then they start impacting the balance sheet meaningfully for the longer term. And you can see at around 10% level, that's what this graph shows, the bottom line, there's an additional revenue of between $300 and $400 million that could be expected. The higher that tariff goes, the higher the additional revenue would be, but there could be an impact on slowing down of economic activity, which would be a negative potentially in the whole picture. So artificial intelligence is something that has driven markets around the world, and they've had a big impact on some of the Magnificent Seven, as they've been called in the US. We've had a concern that parts of the US market are very expensive, and we've been underweight those areas. But what has happened, in January, we saw the launch of something called DeepSeek, which was an artificial intelligence model that was launched out of China that didn't need these high-powered computer chips to run, which things like ChatGPT do. And so that's impacted the future outlook of some of these large cap companies, the Magnificent Sevens. And these two graphs just show you how their earnings have been revised downwards, not to losses, but not as lofty as they were previously, the future earnings expectations. And we've also seen how the US tech sector has come under a lot of pressure since the launch of DeepSeek, and the Chinese tech sector has actually improved. And this just demonstrates that markets are sensitive to the cost of production for different companies, and tariffs will feed into that as well around the world. For those who live in South Africa and are exposed to this economy, the big question is, well, how are these tariffs going to affect us? They've started out with a 30% proposed tariff, and this graph just shows you how our exports to America, which only make up just under 7.5% of our total exports, how are they broken up? And you can see that we mentioned earlier that the iron and aluminium and automotives were going to get the 25% tariff anyway. They do make up just on 20% of our total exports, but the biggest portion of our exports actually is by way of precious metals and stones. And you can see that makes up some 57% of our exports. In total, that amounts to around 65 billion rand, but 76% of that, so about 50 billion of the 65 billion, are not impacted by any tariffs at all. So there are areas where there are going to be challenges. The automotive industry, iron and steel, and aluminium, but that will have to be negotiated. However, the bulk of our exports to the US are not actually influenced by this, and so it's not all doom and gloom. And bear in mind that exports to the US only make up less than 7.5% of our total exports.